The first time Caleb Mercer stepped onto my orchard, he didn't introduce himself, didn't ask about the trees, didn't even pretend to admire the place. He jabbed a bright orange survey stick into the ground beside the oldest apple tree on the property, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Come Monday morning, every one of these trees is gone, with or without your signature." I remember staring at that little strip of plastic ribbon fluttering in the breeze, then at the bark of a tree my great-grandfather planted with his own hands over a century ago, and for a second I honestly couldn't decide which one of us had just been insulted more. I tore his cashier's check clean in half, let both pieces fall onto the gravel between his polished boots, and said, "Then you'd better bring your whole legal department on Monday." He laughed, not the nervous kind of laugh people use when they're uncomfortable, but the confident laugh of a man who'd spent his whole life believing money always arrived before consequences. Looking back now, I think that's exactly why he never saw me coming. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and if you drove through the little town of Ash Hollow 20 years ago, you probably wouldn't have noticed my place. 11 acres tucked against a rolling hillside, rows of crooked apple trees that looked older than most of the houses downtown, a faded white barn that leaned just enough to make visitors nervous, and a farmhouse that had been patched together by 4 generations of people who believed replacing something was almost always a worse idea than repairing it. My grandfather used to joke that our family didn't really own the orchard. We were simply borrowing it from the people who came before us until it was time to hand it over to the people who came after. I grew up hearing that sentence so many times I stopped thinking about it. But after everyone was gone, after Mom passed, after Dad followed 2 winters later, those words became the only thing that kept the place feeling alive. Every tree held a memory. One still had the scar where my brother crashed his bicycle when we were kids. Another leaned slightly because lightning struck it sometime in the 70s. The oldest tree stood near the western fence, twisted and stubborn, planted in 1908 according to a faded family journal that lived in my kitchen drawer. My great-grandfather had written that if the tree ever stopped producing apples, the family should still leave it standing because it had already earned the right to grow old. That's the kind of people I came from. We didn't throw things away just because they stopped making money. Caleb Mercer came from a different world entirely. His company had transformed half the county into neighborhoods with names like Willow Ridge, Silver Creek Estates, and Orchard View, which was funny because most of the real orchards had disappeared to make room for them. He was on magazine covers, cutting ribbons beside politicians, talking about revitalizing rural communities. Around town, people either admired him or feared him, depending on whether they owed him money. Me, I just thought he talked too much. He parked his black SUV in front of my house that Friday afternoon with 3 people behind him, a surveyor, an attorney, and a young assistant, who spent the entire meeting pretending not to look embarrassed. Caleb unfolded glossy renderings across the hood of his vehicle like he was revealing blueprints for heaven itself. "Dog park here," he said, pointing directly at my orchard. "Walking trails through this section. Community gardens over there. Families will love it." I looked down at the drawing and realized whoever made it hadn't bothered to include a single one of my trees. They erased 100 years with the click of a mouse. "You're missing something," I said quietly. He smiled. "What?" "Reality." His attorney chuckled politely, assuming we were making conversation, but Caleb's smile disappeared. He slid the cashier's check toward me. It was enough money to buy another house outright. Enough for most people to thank him through tears. I didn't even pick it up. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, softening his voice like he was speaking to a child, "you don't want to spend the rest of your life taking care of dying trees." I reached over, tore the check in half without breaking eye contact, and let the wind carry one piece into the ditch. His assistant actually gasped. Caleb stared at me for a long second before nodding slowly. "Monday," he said. "I'll bury this orchard on Monday." Then he grabbed one of the survey stakes from the back of the truck and drove it straight into the ground beside my oldest apple tree. The metal tip scraped through thick roots before disappearing into the dirt, and I swear I felt it in my chest. He climbed back into his SUV and left in a cloud of dust, while I stood there listening to the orchard settle back into silence. My neighbor Walt wandered over about an hour later carrying 2 coffees like he always did on Fridays. He didn't ask what happened. He simply looked at the survey stake, shook his head, and muttered, "That man doesn't know this town very well." I smiled, but inside I wasn't nearly as calm as I looked. I'd barely slept that weekend. Every creak of the old house sounded like heavy equipment rolling up the driveway early. Every gust of wind made me imagine branches snapping beneath bulldozer tracks. Around midnight Sunday, I pulled an old cedar box down from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were family photographs, my father's pocket watch, my mother's handwritten recipes, and beneath them all, wrapped carefully in yellowed cloth, was a document no one outside my family had thought about in decades. I unfolded it slowly across the kitchen table, tracing faded ink with my fingertips as memories I hadn't visited in years came rushing back. My father once told me, most people inherit land. Our family inherited a promise. Monday morning was only a few hours away, and for the first time since Caleb Mercer planted that survey stake, I realized the promise my father left behind might be the only thing standing between my orchard and the biggest mistake Caleb Mercer would ever make. At sunrise, I was already sitting on the front porch with a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, watching a light fog drift between the rows of apple trees, and I kept hearing my father's voice in my head telling me that paper only mattered when someone still had the courage to defend what was written on it. At exactly 8:15, the rumble of diesel engines echoed across the valley. 3 pickup trucks, a flatbed hauling a backhoe, another truck carrying fencing material, and behind them, Caleb Mercer's black SUV rolled up my driveway like they already owned the place. His foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Rick, climbed out first carrying a rolled set of plans under one arm and a stapler in the other. He walked straight to my front gate, stapled a bright orange notice onto the post, then turned toward me with the kind of practiced smile people use when they deliver bad news for a living. "Morning, ma'am." I'd step back if I were you. "We're clearing everything west of the fence line today." I never moved from the porch. "You might want to make sure you actually know where the fence line is." He shrugged. "Not my job." Caleb stepped out of his SUV wearing pressed jeans, polished boots, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. He glanced around the orchard with complete indifference, as though the century-old trees were weeds waiting to be pulled. "Last chance. Evelyn," he called. "You could still walk away with a generous offer." I slowly stood, carried my coffee mug down the steps, and set it on the hood of his SUV. "Touch one branch," I said quietly, "and you'll spend the next decade explaining yourself in court." A couple of workers exchanged uneasy looks, but Caleb laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you all hear that?" he shouted. "We've been threatened by a history lesson." The crew chuckled, because that's what crews do when the boss laughs. Rick waved the backhoe operator forward. The diesel engine roared to life. The bucket lifted, and the machine crawled toward my oldest apple tree. I didn't run in front of it. I didn't scream. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, snapped one picture of the machine crossing the property line, then climbed into my old Ford truck. Caleb frowned. "Where are you going?" I rolled down the window. "To keep a promise." Then I drove away. In my rearview mirror, I watched him shake his head with absolute confidence, convinced he'd just won. 20 minutes later, I walked into the county archives building where nearly everyone still knew me by name. Martha Benson had worked behind the records counter for almost 30 years. She looked over her reading glasses as I hurried inside. "Evelyn, you look like somebody lit your barn on fire." "Not yet," I answered, trying to smile. "I need book 12, page 341. Original filing." Her eyebrows lifted. "Nobody's asked for that in." She stopped counting. "Just get it," I said softly. Martha disappeared into the climate-controlled records room while I paced the lobby. Every passing minute felt heavier than the last because I knew machinery was still sitting among those trees. When she returned, she carried a thick leather-bound volume with both hands and laid it carefully on the table between us. "Still intact," she whispered. "Amazing, isn't it?" I carefully opened the book to a page written in elegant fountain pen script dated June 14, 1911. My great-grandfather Elijah Brooks had purchased the land from a neighboring family after years of saving every spare dollar he earned hauling timber. Most people would have stopped reading after the property description. I kept going until my finger reached the paragraph I remembered from childhood. There it was, exactly as my father had shown me decades earlier. An agricultural preservation covenant, drafted by an attorney who apparently distrusted future developers as much as Elijah did. The language was old-fashioned, but its meaning was unmistakable. If the designated heritage orchard was intentionally destroyed or converted in violation of the covenant, ownership of 3 adjoining parcels originally transferred with the development rights would automatically revert to the Brooks estate or its lawful heirs. I read it twice, then 3 times, just to steady my own breathing. Caleb had spent years assembling land around my property, but somewhere along the way, nobody had bothered to trace every restriction back to its original filing. They assumed old paper had become meaningless. Martha watched my face. "You found it, didn't you?" I nodded. "I need certified copies. Right now." By 9 o'clock, I was sitting across from my attorney, Daniel Harper, a quiet man who spoke so calmly, people often mistook him for passive until they realized he'd already prepared 3 arguments while they were still explaining the problem. He finished reading the covenant, leaned back in his chair, and let out a long whistle. "Well," he finally said, "if this survives judicial review, it will." "I know," he answered with a slight smile. "I just enjoy watching opposing counsel discover it." Within minutes, his office prepared an emergency filing to enforce the covenant and record notice against the affected parcels. At exactly 9:14 a.m., the documents were electronically recorded with the county. Daniel looked at the confirmation timestamp, taps the paper with one finger, and said, "Now let's see how expensive confidence can become." The first phone call arrived less than an hour later. It wasn't Caleb. It was the county planning office asking whether a dispute had arisen involving Mercer's Ridge development because their permitting software had automatically flagged 3 active construction lots under conflicting ownership claims. By lunchtime, every permit touching those parcels had been temporarily suspended pending legal review. Around 1 in the afternoon, Caleb's attorney finally called. His voice sounded relaxed, almost amused. "Mrs. Brooks, surely this is a misunderstanding. That covenant is over a century old." "So is the Constitution," I replied. Silence. "Old documents aren't automatically enforceable." "Interesting," I said. "Then perhaps you can explain why your client requested a zoning variance last year, specifically referencing historic deed restrictions affecting adjacent parcels." He stopped talking. I could actually hear papers shuffling on his desk. "Where did you get that?" "Public records." Another long silence followed before he cleared his throat. "We'll discuss this after reviewing the file." He hung up without saying goodbye. By late afternoon, rumors had already reached town. Walt called to tell me construction crews were standing around doing nothing because inspectors had shown up and ordered equipment parked until ownership questions were resolved. Someone posted drone footage online showing freshly poured foundations surrounded by orange stopwork notices. The local newspaper picked up the story before dinner. Their headline wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. "Historic deed restriction delays major housing project." By Tuesday morning, the headline had spread farther than anyone expected. Buyers scheduled to close on 2 model homes postponed their purchases. The lender financing Mercer's newest construction phase requested additional legal assurances before releasing more funds. Subcontractors began asking whether they would still be paid if the delays continued. One overlooked paragraph from 1911 had started rippling through a project worth millions. I spent Tuesday afternoon walking through the orchard, trimming dead branches the way my father taught me. And for the first time in days, I felt my shoulders relax. Every few minutes, my phone buzzed with another update from Daniel. Another filing, another conference call, another request from Mercer's lawyers. They suddenly wanted to negotiate. Funny how quickly people discover respect once expensive problems begin multiplying. Wednesday morning, while I was stacking wooden crates inside the barn, another black SUV rolled into the driveway. This time, Caleb came alone. No attorney, no survey crew, no audience. He stood beside the fence for several seconds before speaking. "Maybe," he said quietly, "we got off on the wrong foot." I couldn't help smiling. "No, Caleb. You drove over the right foot just fine." For the first time since we'd met, he didn't have an answer ready, and that silence told me something every legal filing already had. The man who came to bury my family's history had finally realized he might have built his future on the wrong piece of ground. Caleb took off his sunglasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking again. And that alone told me more than any apology ever could, because men like him never uncovered their eyes unless they were finally ready to see something they had ignored. "Let's fix this," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Tell me what it'll take." I leaned against the old fence my grandfather had rebuilt 3 different times over the years and looked past him toward the orchard. A breeze moved through the branches, carrying that familiar scent of apples and damp earth, and for a second I could almost picture my father walking those rows with pruning shears hanging from his belt. "You know," I said, "my dad always believed a person's first offer tells you exactly who they think you are." Caleb frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means your first offer wasn't money. It was disrespect." He looked down at the gravel without answering. I wasn't interested in humiliating him. I had imagined that moment more than once over the previous few days. Imagined raising my voice or making him stand there while I reminded him of every arrogant word he'd spoken. But standing there in the morning light, I realized none of that would bring my parents back or make those trees any younger. Revenge fades. Responsibility doesn't. Here's what's going to happen, I said. The orchard stays exactly where it is. It's protected permanently, recorded properly, and nobody from your company ever sets foot in it again without my permission. He nodded almost immediately. Done. Second, every survey marker, every temporary notice, every piece of equipment your crew left behind comes off my property before sunset. Done. He hesitated, hoping the conversation was over. It wasn't. And those 3 parcels your model homes are sitting on. I paused just long enough to watch him realize where I was going. You're gonna lease them. His eyes narrowed. Lease them? From me? For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked the only question he had left. For how long? 99 years. His shoulders sagged. And the rent? I smiled for the first time since he'd driven that survey stake into my orchard. My attorney will explain the numbers. 2 weeks later, we signed the agreement in a conference room at the county courthouse. Nobody celebrated. There were no reporters inside. No dramatic speeches. No victorious handshake for the cameras. Just a stack of documents. 2 attorneys. A court clerk. And a developer signing page after page because the alternatives would have cost him far more. The final agreement required Mercer's company to pay me $6,800 every month under a 99-year ground lease, maintain insurance, acknowledge the historic covenant, and fund a local preservation program that would help protect other heritage farms around the county. That last condition surprised him. You could have asked for more money, he said quietly after signing the final page. I know, I answered. Money wasn't the lesson I wanted remembered. Within a month, the stop work orders were lifted, construction resumed, and the subdivision eventually opened, just not the way Caleb had originally planned. The dog park still got built, but on land his company donated several blocks away. Families still moved into beautiful homes. Children still rode bicycles through the neighborhood, and every Saturday morning, some of those same families wandered over to my roadside apple stand where I'd sell fresh cider, homemade pies, and bags of apples picked from the very trees that almost disappeared. Most of them had no idea they were parking beside a piece of local history that had quietly rewritten an entire development. Caleb and I crossed paths a handful of times after that. He was never exactly friendly, but he was respectful. And honestly, I think respect is worth more because it usually costs people something to earn. One autumn afternoon nearly a year later, I saw him standing at the edge of the orchard while a group of elementary school kids toured the farm. He waited until they walked ahead with their teacher before speaking. I drove past here yesterday, he said. The trees looked good. I looked up into the branches, glowing orange beneath the October sun. They've been looking good for over 100 years. He nodded slowly. I should have asked before I assumed. Yes, I replied. You should have. Then he smiled, just a little, and walked back to his truck. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was simply the end of a fight that never should have started. These days, my mornings look a lot like they always have. I wake before sunrise, pour a cup of coffee, and walk the same winding path through the orchard where 4 generations of my family have walked before me. The oldest tree still leans toward the west fence exactly the way it always has. The scar from my brother's bicycle is still there. The lightning mark my grandfather used to point out is still easy to find if the afternoon sun hits it just right. Sometimes I stop beside that old survey stake, the one I eventually pulled from the ground and hung inside the barn as a reminder. Not a reminder that I won, because that's never been the point. It's there to remind me how quickly people confuse age with weakness, how easily they mistake quiet for surrender, and how dangerous it can be to believe history has no value simply because it's old. Every month, another lease payment arrives in the mail, and every month I smile for exactly the same reason. It isn't because of the money. It's because somewhere my great-grandfather's promise is still being kept. Not by luck, not by anger, but because one man had the wisdom to write down what mattered, and another generation refused to let those words fade with time. So now I'd like to ask you something. If you had been standing where I stood that Monday morning, watching someone prepare to erase a century of your family's history, what would you have done? Would you have taken the money and walked away, or would you have fought for the land no matter the cost? And do you think Caleb deserved the second chance after everything that happened? Or should there have been even greater consequences for trying to bulldoze someone else's legacy? Let me know what you honestly think down in the comments because stories like this rarely have simple answers. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes the oldest promises are sometimes stronger than the newest fortunes. You never know whose family story might still be waiting beneath a forgotten piece of paper.